To the surprise of absolutely no one, it is with great pleasure and anticipation that I, the Mara of Gengar, proudly present to you the elusive man behind the luchador mask and renowned industry legend, Goichi Suda! Legit though, I don't think there's a bigger inspiration to me when it comes to both creative finesse and stylish sensibilities than Grasshopper Manufacture and of course, Suda51. If you've ever watched my stuff before, this probably doesn't shock you too much. There's no shortage of times I've rambled on about my love for anyone who dares to deconstruct the norms of their respective art form. But still, it rings true now more than ever. I've always had the utmost respect for the master of all things stylish, from his humble beginnings at Human Entertainment, directing games like the ever-so-obscure Moonlight Syndrome, which desperately needs a fan translation, all the way to his more recent endeavors and the creative liberties that came with those. There's just something special about Suda's approach to game design, and rightfully so. The man carved his way into gaming history with style by doing what everyone else refused to do. And in a way, it's kinda hard not to feel some form of admiration towards any creator known for taking the beaten path, diverging from what's being done in the industry in order to do what they really feel like doing, no matter how strange or convoluted the vision might seem. I just really vibe with that notion. In fact, there's this specific quote of his that I keep very close to my heart. I hate doing things that other people do. I like to develop games that nobody else will think about. Paraphrasing a bit here, but you get the idea. This specific design philosophy is something I strive for on the end of my own creative shtick, especially now that I've got more than a couple of eyes on my work. In a sea of people creating thematically similar stuff to yours, you have to do something to stand out. Gotta take risks, do something weird and out there to mark yourself as worth the time of the day. Make your dream game that appeals exclusively to your own sense of style. Work on that essay about your niche obsession for a dead game only 12 people care about. But be yourself in every step of the way. It's all stuff I've come to realize over the past few months through works of other artists with their own stylistic preferences. There's too much of a push in most mainstream gaming circles to be reserved or even ashamed of what you like if it doesn't exactly fit the frame of what's considered cool at the time. And I sure as hell ain't got the time to worry about what other people think of what I vibe with. Being weird and out there isn't as bad as it's made out to be.
You ever met the kind of people that come to these Stacy concerts? These dudes have got energy to spare. We're talking guys who beat off 4 times a day.
All these feelings stemming from a single quote that lives rent-free, all cozy in the back of my brain as I find myself writing, conjuring thoughts about the experience showcased on this channel, or even while playing video games on the side. And it's from said quote that I gain an even deeper understanding, as well as appreciation for Suda51 and his self-claimed punk way of design. After all, it's not every day you get to see pretty big figureheads of the gaming industry appropriating a label like that, let alone describe their own body of work with it. And I mean, yeah, what's more punk than going against the grain, constantly toying with and subverting expectations, even poking fun at old school gaming contrivances, never in a better-than-thou pretentious attitude, but more as a cheeky nod to the player who knows what they're up to, as if our boy Suda made some elements tedious on purpose, just so he could later wag his finger at you through the screen, going all, no, you will collect every key, you'll travel to the entire apartment complex knocking on every single door, and you better activate those neurons for the math puzzles waiting for you. And you know what? Hell yeah, I will. It's with that general attitude and core design philosophy that Suda's been recognized over the years as a highly creative director, writer, and designer, with a style unmatched in the industry. His writing is just out of this world in how it feels both extremely professional, practically verbose at times, while still adding all sorts of mannerism and casual speech patterns that add a lot of flavor to what you're reading. The dude never held back on swears, curses, slang, and lingo. All sorts of familiar stuff that makes the experience feel a lot more special than the poetic JRPG talk of yesteryear. And by all means, there's some of that too, but it's only used contextually, when it fits the mood. So even though you're going through life's shit, investigating rampant murder cases, or trying to climb your way through a hierarchy of assassins, you're still out there chatting with the homies about the daily things, like this and that and what is what, all done in the most flavorful of ways. It's through those extremely unique dialogues, as well as certain gaming elements, that you can see Suda's personality shine through. His passions like wrestling and baseball always present in some aspect. His interest towards cinematography and literature reflected in how his works are framed, how they look, how they read. His love for unconventional music, often referencing British punk bands. even hiring actual DJs to do some of his soundtracks, and of course, his own personal life tapestry, like how working as an undertaker deeply affected the way he portrays death as a narrative element. One moment you're discussing the geopolitical repercussions of global world peace, the other you're doing whatever the fuck Jabroni was doing all over the 25th ward. Combine that with the unconventional yet beautiful art direction, and it makes for shit you can't get anywhere else. Some truly unique experiences that are almost universally tied to each other in some way, shape, or form, adding even more layers of intricacies to each of their respective designs and what is simply known as Kill the Past. A series of games directed by the man himself, all sharing one common ideology. To kill the past is to destroy what burdens you. Most if not all central characters in Suda's games will find themselves at odds with prior events of their lives, and will have to confront them head-on in order to move forward. It's a series that includes tons of recurring themes like death and resurrection, the prominent presence of the moon, televisions as a framing device, assassins, most of which are dressed stylish as all hell, and even recurring characters throughout the entire series. Sometimes coming at the expense of the player's confusion, but I don't know, I just fuck hard with the vision. Some might go ahead and describe Suda's work as constantly breaking the fourth wall, but I kinda see it in the inverse way if it makes any sense. His games never feel constricted by walls, nor limits. The moment you pick up the controller, you as the player are intrinsically connected to these worlds, the characters, and what they entail, some even addressing you directly rather than through the persona you play as. And while all this stuff could have felt like this very tongue-in-cheek wink at the camera garbage, it never feels cheap or stilted. In turn, this results in his entire body of work having this deeply unique feel on a meta-narrative sense. And it's through that same lens that I want to look at Killer7, the game that would launch Suda's name into fame over here on the western side of things. And while I know there's definitely some quote-unquote optimal order of play for maximum comprehension, Kill the Past as a series is composed of titles who defy traditional reading and analysis techniques, so I too will shed the shackles and contrivances of YouTuber, review man, funny man format. We're going into funky bitch territory now, boys. Let's go. To try and reduce Killer7 to a conventionally short description, one in the broadest of gamer terms at that, is a fool's errand. Cause yeah, I can start whipping out descriptors left and right like action-adventure, first-person shooter, survival horror puzzles mixed with on-rail unconventional control schemes. All those genre and nouns smashed together still won't help you get a proper feel for the thing. So instead I'd rather jump directly into what the game means to me, personally. I've never been one to do top 10s, or even say much of what my favorite games are altogether. There's some pretty obvious ones out there. You can definitely already tell a few just by the amount of times I'll casually name drop them in videos. But all in all, my faves are almost always rotating. I'll play some cool new stuff, end up loving the shit out of it, and feel like it was my all-time favorite, only to play something else at a later date that'll totally get me by surprise. That one's my fave for sure, and then the cycle begins anew. When I decide to cover stuff on the channel, it's usually because I already have a genuine love for the topic I'm presenting, so you can kinda get that this is a game that probably means a lot to me. And as right as you'd be to assume so, this time it's a whole lot different. Killer7 is one of, if not the, most influential game I've ever played. Genuinely arrived at what seemed like the perfect time in my life. Opened my eyes to a world of stylistic decisions, most of which would still influence me to this very day, and of course, just an all-around banger. Look, if the guy who made it himself considered it his proudest achievement, even after making the god-tier game that is the 25th ward, you can already tell that shit's Gucci. Killer7 is by all means the best game you've never played. This is how it was sold to me initially, and in turn how I want to sell it to you. Even though realistically, years have gone by since then, so there's a pretty big chance you've already played through it, and if not, at least heard of it. But the feeling stays the same. Story-wise, Killer7 follows the Smith Syndicate, a group of assassins helmed by the mysterious Harmon Smith, a man who can, at any moment, channel one of 7 killers squatting in his brain in order to do some good old-fashioned adjusting, i.e., taking hitman jobs from the US government to clean up bad guys, terrorist organizations, and politicians, one after the other with no discrimination. All while the plot and its threads tangle themselves and weaves a web of political intrigue like no other. The game is set in an alternate future, in the post-global peace world of 2011. Yeah, I know, said like that it makes our reality look even bleaker, but hear me out, okay? A lot of the story deals with subject matters like how society has evolved since then, political conspiracies, the role of Japan in regards to US politics, the nature of secret organizations. Even the Smith Syndicate's purpose, as a sort of last resort to do the government's dirty work, is put into question. And that's not even mentioning some of the key characters behind it all. Armin's best frenemy and eternal rival, Kun Lan, the ever-reincarnating god/demon who lives only for causing mischief, and his favorite bunch of fuck freaks, the Heaven Smiles, mutated creatures acting out as living bombs sent out to terrorize the entire world. Each of these elements are juxtaposed perfectly onto a stylized, cel-shaded aesthetic, complete with cinematic camera angles, ever-evolving art styles both clashing and melting together perfectly, a flavorful cast of eccentric fuckos you'll meet along the way, the coolest color scheme on this side of the Pantone, and of course, a sleek UI to seal the deal. I really can't understate how fucking cool Killer7 looks. It's rare to find a game that you can pause at any moment and be met with an art book level of composition. But as much praise as I can chuck towards it, it's easy to forget that it wasn't always regarded this way. A concept game, an art house game, a simple game, but a beautiful one at that. Killer7's initial reception was pretty mixed with gaming journos, critics, and basic bitch boys alike. It was described as a niche product for aficionados only, even though some would still end up praising the game for its uniqueness, regardless of public perception, calling it one of the most thought-provoking experiences of the genre, an artfully designed footnote of gaming history, a title that would pave the way for future creative leeway in what can be told to the medium as a whole. And while I generally agree with those sentiment, people now seem to only focus on those specific positive aspects rather than what actually happened at the time. And I don't know, I ain't about that revisionist history shit. For quite some time, it was seen as that one obscure game with unintuitive controls and no broad audience appeal. It was getting dunked on for having low, wacky Japanese storytelling filled to the brim with concepts far too complex for your average 8-year-old to truly understand, and a style so sharp it could bleed an adult male in mere seconds. It was a game niche by design, and it's only through the years that it gained the reputation and love it has today. A lot of people came to know Killer7 because they heard through the grapevine about how avant-garde this should be, probably by some other weird kid who fuck with the weird shit. Said people would then go on and spread the good word to a couple more homies, who in turn would do the same with their own, and so on and so forth. And I hope this doesn't come off as some sort of lame-ass, preachy gatekeeping type of beat. I don't think there's anything wrong with jumping on the bandwagon, because damn right, that's what I did. But back then, only the nichest and coolest of gamers recognized Killer7 as the gem it already was. Cause if sales numbers are to be believed, it's only thanks to that sort of playground mythical reputation and a couple favorable reviews that it started gaining that cult classic status. The type of stuff you see at your local game store but never reach out to, cause you're still a kid and money's hella limited. You probably only get a few new games a year, so you'd rather go with the safer option. The games you know you'll vibe with rather than branching out with the more niche stuff. The Chibi-Robos, the Batenkaitos, and Lost Kingdoms of this world. God fucking knows I spent my birthday money on Sonic Adventure 2 before I ever touched any of those, especially Killer7. There was no way my mom was gonna let me buy something rated M for mature. But there ain't no shame to that, because Sonic is my friend and he said it's okay.
Whoa!
And in a similar fashion to the Blue Blur himself, Killer7's gameplay puts a large emphasis on getting you from one point to another, never looking at the destination ahead, but rather savoring all that's in between. I phrase it like that because realistically, it's a whole lot of moving. Granted, through beautifully crafted set pieces, but walking nonetheless. And while you do travel through, enemies will make sure to keep you on your toes every second of the way. The moment you enter any room, you're greeted with this. Laughter that indicates the presence of nearby Heaven Smiles, who are, most likely, on a direct course to jump your ass. So your job is to make sure you properly dispatch them before they do the same to you. Things aren't as simple as they look though. To find those enemies in the first place, you'll need to scan them. Technically, you can still spot their outlines without it, so you're not completely left in the dark as to where everything is, but they do be invulnerable till you lock eyes with the fuckers. And since you want to make sure to goon every last one of them, scanning it be. Revealing the locations also shows you their weak spot, and with the ton of enemy types you'll be introduced to, it's information you'll need in order not to get overwhelmed. And in most cases, that glowing spot means insta-kill, so best you can do is get aiming ASAP. Though you'll figure out quickly that some enemies are best dealt with certain characters, the backside smiles for example. Like the name indicates, their weak spot is located behind them, so the easiest way to get it exposed is to rapidly shoot their wings in order to have them turn around. This is best done with characters who can unload fast, like Khan or Coyote. Same thing goes for the Protector and Mithril Smiles. Since they both have armor, Mask the Smith is the one to face their ass, since the dude's packing 2 grenade launchers with him 24/7. On the other hand though, said Masked Luchador can't deal with enemies that require precision, so you get the idea. Each character comes in with their own unique weapon type, as well as special ability. For as complicated as the plot can get sometimes, the core gameplay loop is extremely straightforward in comparison. The moment you spot an enemy's weakness and know how to take care of it, you'll instantly get accustomed to doing that every single time. And as you progressively mow down Heaven Smiles one after the other with no impunity, you'll also obtain their blood, coming in 2 variety for your own luxury. Thin blood being a source of HP accessible from your pause menu, while the thick kind can be used to upgrade each character, unlocking utility moves that can give you a real advantage against the swarm of enemies you'll deal with. Stuff like the down attack that kills any goons on the floor, or the counter move, which also grinds Smiles into dust at the cost of giving up their precious blood. And while you pump up the Mad Doctor's blood-sucking machine, you can also increase each Smith's overall strength, shot speed, and all that good passive stuff. Nothing overly complex or on the same level of depth as your typical RPGs, but it does incentivize you to keep playing like a champ and aim for them glowy bits. Since to get blood in the first place, you gotta score the juiciest of crits to guarantee it from dropping.
Hurts, doesn't it?
And while all of this is good, there's one outlier in the midst of Smith. Garshin, the self-proclaimed cleaner of the group, which plays a little different than the rest of what you've seen. If at any moment one of Harmon's personas die on the battlefield, either because you got overwhelmed or just straight up walked out of a corner into a bomb, you'll have to travel from the last save room as him to resurrect your fallen allies. There's no actual limit to how many times you can do this, so it's pretty forgiving, but if you do die on the way there, it's instant game over, so it never feels too free either. There's definitely a lot of tension to be had, since Garshin's weapon, the silenced pistol, is the weakest of them all, and he's the only character who can't be upgraded whatsoever. So the entire time you're playing as him, you're just praying you don't have to deal with any enemies that require actual thought. Because as simple as some of those are in isolated situations, like when they get introduced, once there's a fuck ton of them running at you with varying abilities, movement speed, and weak spots, you gotta start prioritizing which one to gun down first. This transforms the core gameplay loop into this extremely satisfying game of cat and mouse between your band of local assassins and the Heaven Smiles trying their best to swarm you. Eventually you'll find yourself snapping dudes in half shot by shot, all while hearing each of the Smith's unique corps when they strike gold with the crit hits. As cheesy as some of those lines can get, especially with the extremely edgy "you're fucked" that Coyote loves to whip out, that sort of auditory feedback never gets old to me. In a way, it kinda contributes to character identity. Despite the playable roster remaining cloaked in mystery for most of the game, those indents of personality is something constantly highlighted. Every small character quirk, down to the way they walk or hold their weapon even, revealing details as to what type of person each of them are. It's something mostly shown through contextual cutscenes, which is something I'll definitely talk about in a bit, but it's also heavily reflected via gameplay. Each member of the Smith Syndicate has their own special ability. From Dan's collateral shot melting enemies in a blast, to more puzzle-oriented ones like Kaede removing obstacles by coating them in her own blood. And while some of them are clearly more effective on the offense than others, they all serve in some way as environmental puzzle solving. Certain enemies only die from certain abilities, some paths can only be accessed by specific characters, and a lot of that feels organic with the level design presented to you. You're constantly on the lookout for stuff like that, switching characters on the fly without ever feeling like you're just left in the dark, trying your best to figure out where to go at all times. It can feel pretty intimidating at first sight, but it really ain't that bad. In most cases, you traverse places, find items, and then use said items to traverse more places, all while solving the survival horrorist puzzles known to me. You know, the good old fire ring lights up the candles, the water one refills the vase, and all that good stuff. And while it might seem extremely simple on paper, because sometimes it is, levels will get progressively harder with more and more obstacles and puzzles gating your progression. Looking specifically at the Gashapon machine in the Cloudman chapter with its purposefully missing parts, that one's a keeper. Overall though, none of them managed to overstay their welcome, besides maybe the color puzzle, but I think that's mostly on me for forgetting a key card in the most obvious of spots, having to backtrack all the way there in what can only be described as a true walk of shame. If you're especially struggling, you're also never too far from a hint either. The ever so precious Iwazaru is always there to dispense his incredible knowledge upon you, and will keep most of your frustrations at bay. And if you're really stuck, there's also Yunhyun, who will literally spoon-feed the answers straight into your mouth at the cost of some thick blood, even though doing so will result in the dude calling you a loser for having to rely on him. But the most interesting, and probably controversial aspect of Killer7 comes not from any of its politically inclined story threads, settings, or even gameplay intricacies, but rather from its core conception, its control scheme. There's no sense in sugarcoating it. It took me a while to get used to it back then, and it still took a while to get used to it now. You move by holding down the A button, and your character is set on a predetermined road, if you will. Each level being filled to the brim with branching paths serving as intersections, leading them to mostly loop on themselves. In an era of gaming that was all about expensive control schemes, 360-degree wide angles, and free-moving camera movement, you can tell this must have been a point of contention for many. And honestly, having to tank control my way through shit, that's cool, I can handle it. But micro-adjusting every shot I take with a GameCube control stick while Heaven Smiles are just booking it in my direction, that's fucked up. So extremely happy that the PC version exists, not just for the HD widescreen look either, but mostly because the controls here feel much more intuitive. I still spent the first mission playing with a controller, so there's some footage that looks extremely bad on my part, but the moment I switched to mouse and keyboard, it was like night and day. There's definitely still a big learning curve with juggling stuff like scanning, shooting, and backing out of enemies' range all at once, but it's a lot smoother than the original. To be completely honest though, contrived and obtuse gameplay is something Suda's more than known for at this point. From having to jack off your Wiimote to recharge your blade in No More Heroes, to Michigan Report from Hell and how you play as the cameraman, completely unable to interact with anything, only watching and hopefully pointing your homies in the right direction so they can do your job as protagonist. The entire ethos of his work seemed to revel in that stuff, so this isn't coming from a place of judgment, but rather from an informative point of view. As an avid enthusiast for all things niche and convoluted, I defo fuck with the idea, but I can also see how some people might not. Taste is entirely subjective, and I can't really tell you what's good or not, only my thoughts and feelings. You'll just have to go out there and form your own opinions based on said information and your future experiences. The stuff of real forward thinkers, right? Something I did really enjoy about Killer7, and rarely see get talked about, is the gameplay's relation to the rest of the game's elements. Rather than having the storytelling be a vessel to engage into the game's core mechanics, the gameplay itself is conductive of the story. The convoluted controls adding to the already existing tension and severity of the situations you find yourself in. The puzzles actively incentivizing you to memorize the layout of each individual level. It all serves in making you, the player, pay closer attention to the events unfolding. You feel more engaged with the central plot because the gameplay feeds directly into that story rather than the opposite. Instead of having the gameplay be center stage and the music, story, and art direction being relegated to contextualizing it, I've always favored the opposite way, having the gameplay enhance each of those respective elements. It's definitely a matter of how you look at the medium though, and as a whole, that's entirely subjective. But basically, the reason why I got into gaming as a kid was because I was a huge book nerd, and I mostly came in for those stories. I was willing to stomach a lot of grinding, tedious tasks, and all sorts of repetitive gameplay fuckery as long as the story remained interesting enough. Which is why a lot of the games I vibe with are some that ask you to do some pretty unconventional stuff. Sometimes you gotta trudge through some shit before it really pays off. Titles that take the mundanity of everyday life and incorporate it fully into their design. And for way too long I was embarrassed to admit that I liked that sort of weirdo gaming tropes. I would play through niche and obtuse games but could never bring myself to discuss them with anyone. Most of my teenage years were instead spent trying to fit in, playing competitive online titles, and that nearly ruined my enjoyment of video games as a whole. Instead of getting fully immersed and enjoying a game's story beats, I became more interested in the technical side of things. Playing to get good at stuff, min-maxing, optimizing the fun out of everything I touch. And that's not a dig to people who love that stuff. Everyone's got their own ways of finding what's fun to them. I think there's still a big amount of inherent value to be found in gaining that intrinsic mechanical knowledge, like speedrunning or any fighting game for example. But to me, it kinda became a point of contention. I realized that I spent too long looking at games as if the only aspect that mattered was how it played separated entirely from its art, story, and many other facets. And it's only gradually, over the span of many years, that I regained that passion I initially had, shaking off those awful vibes to don the coat of embarrassingly genuine art lover that I secretly always was inside. The way I look at and talk about video games keeps getting challenged, even more so now that I cover them on here, but it's a good return to basics. A much needed smoothing for the wrinkles covering my well-adjusted gamer brain. Here, even the smallest of details facilitate both story and mechanical know-how in tandem rather than picking one over the other. Like how the mission structure is separated in a way to ease the player into the game's central plot. Yeah, there's still a couple of head scratches here and there, but I feel like Suda gets too much of a bad rap over his storytelling quirks. His style's been compared all around the block to plenty of other creative folks, some going to the length of calling him the Tarantino of games. And I don't know if I'm all about that. I can definitely see the comparison in how both approach their respective art forms. and I think comparing is fine overall, but here it almost feels like it's done solely for the sake of depicting him as this weird artsy meme man. And to me, that feels a bit too derogative. I have no doubt that Suda was most likely inspired by many authors from many different genres, as he very obviously spent his entire career wearing those inspirations proudly on his sleeve. But in this case, the comparison is mostly done by gaming journos rather than Suda himself citing the man as an inspiration. All in all, much of Suda's work and stories happen in a very traditional, linear fashion. Things happen chronologically. It's just that you don't get all the puzzle pieces needed to assemble the full picture up until the very end. If you play through Killer7, one mission at a time, it's actually pretty straightforward the entire way through. Like yeah, there's an overarching narrative spanning the whole game, but every mission feels self-contained. They all act as highly detailed character vignettes for their respective antagonists and major plot beats. And that's something Suda more than excels at. He can create a believable world on a dime, filled with living, breathing characters and seamlessly infuse them with his own feelings, thoughts, and passions. From the recurring cast of remnant psychs haunting you as you progress through each level, all the way to each stage's boss and the way they present themselves. Each character felt entirely unique, and it's really not often that I get to play through a game and remember every single one of them, no matter how small their roles might be. Like I joked a bit earlier about Gimp Boy Iwazaru, but seeing him drop down from the ceiling, no matter how tense the situation was, kinda felt reassuring in a way. It's almost like no matter how dire and strange the circumstances get, you got that one constant thing. Even if sometimes the homie can't help but make the situation just a bit worse. It's definitely not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but the sheer cinematic appeal of Killer7 is also one of my favorite aspects of the game. Each character gets their proper time to shine, as they're being explored through each cutscenes. Just enough to pique your interest, but never to the point of force-feeding you exposition for 15 minutes at a time. The extremely stylish art direction and the amazing soundtrack composed by the legendary Masafumi Takada complementing each scene perfectly. It ended up playing a significant role in my enjoyment, and in making most of those hard-hitting moments as memorable as they happened to be. The Russian roulette scene and the ever-escalating tension reflected perfectly with the track used here, each beat rising and flowing as you feel your heart rate quickening, counting the remaining chambers of the gun that both men rapidly exchange. The characterization done through unique cutscenes for specific characters, showcasing what each individual Smith is made out of. Like Dan's mentor-protege relationship with biggest asshole on the earth Curtis Blackburn and how it plays into the plot. Every time you see Harmon and Kun interacting with each other, it's just an absolute trip. None of this antagonist-protagonist overused banter cliche. Here we got two old chums chatting the day away as they face each other repeatedly through an everlasting game of chess, both literally and figuratively. Something that reflects well each character's role in the major plot. Harmon working by proxy for the US government, while Kunlan has his hands all over the Japanese organizations. Andre Ulmeda and the entirety of his chapter. It captures perfectly not the southern United States culture, but rather the perceived idea of it from the lens of a foreigner. The entire carnival stage and its ever-evolving fantastical landscape, leading to some of the best art direction in the entire game. The empty halls of Coburn Elementary School, channeling perfectly the more mysterious aspects of Killer7, something that was also pointed out earlier in the appearance of Mifra. He was an extremely important character to the Twilight and Moonlight Syndrome line of games, both of which Suda worked on extensively. This time though, the boy appears not as some mischievous god of destruction, but rather acting as a guiding hand in the dark for the Smith Syndicate. His appearance cementing Killer7 even further into the Kill the Past series. I could go on and on and on, but this would rapidly devolve into spoiler territory, and I want to keep this shit as clean as possible in case anyone watching this feels like jumping in. In my eyes, it's 100% worth it, even if the barrier to entry might turn some away. Which is something that ties nicely into another controversial aspect of Suda's career. His works have often been described by many as style over substance. And not that I take offense to that, but I don't really fuck with the idea that one has to take precedent over the other. I've said it before in the Milk video, and I'll say it again. Style and substance are practically one and the same. They're intrinsically connected to each other in such a manner that makes it hard to analyze one without considering how it directly affects the other. And I feel like using that expression says a lot more about the way you choose to see media rather than it does about the game. Because when people say a game is style over substance, it's usually implied under negative connotations. There was a disconnect between what they experienced and how they felt while playing. And so, it's an expression that often denotes that said game masks its lack of content, value, or depth of character behind bright colors and shiny stuff, which I feel does a tremendous disservice to practically any game that falls under that umbrella, but especially Killer7. Literary analysis and criticism is cool and all that, but I don't know. Something doesn't sit right with me when I'm asked to take only one aspect of a piece of art into account, or to separate each of a game's component and accurately describe what they do, or even critique them. It's nearly impossible without considering how they interact with you as well as with each other. Because after all, what is Killer7's gameplay without its avant-garde art direction? And what is that art direction without its unconventional gameplay? They both complete each other, and I feel like that's something each game should strive to achieve. To have a piece of art feel so special, so intertwined in all of its facets that it makes people question and reconsider how they even look at it. Killer7's writing and overall narrative never aged a day. It's stuff that feels both current and of its time all at once. It's filled to the brim with extremely powerful scenes that will leave you questioning yourself, what you saw, and your understanding of storytelling techniques as a whole. Scenes so powerful they shake you to your very core in what can only be described as painfully genuine. There's plenty of moments that stuck with me, but none as impactful as the end of Target 01. We see Garshin and Mills on an overpass, hanging out, chatting, and shooting the shit respectively, when suddenly, the conversation turns to how desensitized they feel when it comes to state violence. Political is the word often used to describe Killer7, and this has turned off many people throughout the years. For some, because of blatant ignorance. The word's been used more than once to talk about very important subjects like racism, homophobia, amongst many others. But I ain't having none of that chuddy bullshit here. For others, because they play games as a way to chill after a hard day of work. They don't want to get subjected to stuff that feels quote-unquote real. Games that demand of them to look inside themselves. And while I don't personally agree, I can kinda get why. It's hard to ask of people to care about situations that don't concern them. We're all being pushed by society to live fast, work fast, and stay isolated inside our own little circle. So much so that sometimes the well-being of another, the desire for deep introspective, tends to come second place because you just want some goddamn peace. It's weird, uncomfortable, and too much for your average video game. Killer7's story can come off as genuinely depressing for some folks. Jerking off to highbrow concepts like political science ain't my forte either. I've read 1984, Animal Farm, and A Clockwork Orange in high school. Doesn't mean I was thrilled about the prospect of learning shit like that. And it's really only through current events happening throughout my formative years that I started getting a grasp on said quote-unquote real shit. I know there's gonna be some political science major fuming because of what I'm about to say, but a huge source of my knowledge when it comes to stuff like that comes from media. Not in a watching the news all day type of brainwashing, but shit like authors who write about fictionalized versions of current events. I was that weird artsy kid who wanted more and more obscure knowledge. So of course I found myself attracted to games with defining art styles who wouldn't shy away from talking about some pretty sensitive topics. Stuff that people would rather ignore. All of which were made by authors who would write with their own varying point of views in mind, their personal baggage, their life experience. Think of Suda, of Kojima, of many others. And I don't care if it's a meme at this point, but there was nothing more eye-opening as a kid than watching the ending of Metal Gear Solid 2 and feeling that flame in my heart. The desire to do good in life, to make this a better place, somehow, some way. The exact words to describe that feeling escape me, but I'm sure it'll resonate with someone out there. Killer7 takes place in a world where people don't matter. It asks of you to care about characters who will remain insignificant regardless of the actions they choose. So much so that the only time you're presented with an actual proper choice, you're met with two parallel outcomes mirroring each other, asking you to reflect on what each of them means and if either of them were worth it in the end. Each character is relegated to being a pawn placed carelessly on a chessboard played by two warring factions, forever locked into trading blows but never defeating one another. In a manner of which that gives meaning to this meaningless world. You just gotta dig deep and find it yourself. It's so easy to dismiss what we don't understand, what feels strange or alien. I don't expect everyone to have a solid grasp of geopolitical conflicts or social-economical repercussions, nor does the game expect you to. Killer7 uses humor through adversity, some peak chaotic energy. It made me tear up. laugh, and experience all sorts of emotions in between. We're talking about a game that has a luchador headbutting a bullet, but we're also talking about a game that speaks of the past, the future, the impending feeling of doom left in your chest that keeps you up at night. It's a game that wants us to kill the past, asking us to move on from what hurts, to find optimism in that chaos. And there's just something liberating about that. You would expect with some of the subject matter's approach, as well as the cast of eccentric goons you meet along the way, that your suspension of disbelief would get stretched beyond fuck. But the way Suda writes, I can't help but take it on the chin, all at face value. Like, yeah, there's an organization/government mandated cult operating in Texas, worshipping the hell out of some swanky dude. Not to be confused with the other swanky dude, who's a ghost feeding you exposition about the world you live in, all while wearing the swaggiest of shirt selections. All the homies are vibing with the bad girl and hustle t-shirts, but the moment Travis whips out the ones with the city names on them, the realization kicks in real fast that those are all places where real-life terrorist attacks happen. Not presented for the sake of shock value, but rather to highlight the significance of what you did in-game, how it reflects to the plot, how it ties to the Heaven Smiles. But it's not all doom and gloom either. There's a severed head constantly giving you progression items and telling you all about her sex life, because who the fuck else would? And of course, the luchador homie over there powers up by putting on different masks. All sorts of weird things that never feel wacky for the sake of it, but rather because that's just how things be. And if it all makes sense in Suda's heart of hearts, then so will it in mine. It's a feeling that extends further than the plot, the characters, and the world they live in. It permeates the entirety of Killer7, and I wouldn't want it any other way.